conversation you're about to listen and watch is part of a project aiming to address illiberal tendencies in Slovenia from the EU perspective and the perspective of EU values. Rule of law, human rights, free media, democracy, these are the topics, Aljaž, that we have done many conversations with excellent experts with. So my name is Nataša Briški. I'm editor-in-chief. I'm editor-in-chief of Metas List. It's an independent media network based in Slovenia. And with me is...
My name is Aljaž Pengov Bitenc. I'm editor of Ljubljana-based Radio Chaos, blogger, podcaster, and according to some people, a general nuisance. Welcome, one and all.
And with us, Aljaž, today is Professor Bojan Bugarič. He's a professor of law at School of Law at University of Sheffield. Professor Bugarič, appreciate your joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Now, before I continue questioning you, you are doing or researching some very interesting topics. Could you say in a couple of words, what are you focused on in the past months, years, maybe?
Well, my new book just came out. It's titled Power to the People, Constitutional Law in the Age of Populism. And it's mostly about the emergence of various populist regimes around the world, published by Oxford University Press. And my next project is about authoritarianism. So I'm really particularly interested in the very interesting trend that we see not only in the region, but around the world, witnessing strong power-hungry authoritarians coming to power by regular electoral route and then undermining democracy from within.
And these are exactly the topics we would like to discuss with you. So how to stop the autocratic regimes in the region. Not to repeat myself too much, but with Aljaž, we have talked and discussed the cases of Poland and Hungary within the EU, and more recently Slovenia as well. We're all coming from Slovenia. That is giving worries to a lot of people. Aljaž, maybe we should start with Professor Bugarič commenting on the recent events in the European Union in the light of the past year and a half, maybe with the epidemic. It seems that it has accelerated the pace of certain developments, not necessarily positive ones. Professor Bugarič,
what we see in Poland, Hungary, and now sadly also following in Slovenia is a quite unfortunate but also worrying development, because the important thing about these countries is that they're, unlike UK, for example, they're not interested in leaving European Union. They want to change the European Union, but change according to their own political ideologies, ideals and preferences, which are very much going against the core fundamental principles on which the EU was founded and based upon when in the 1950s. So these are the countries that, for example, Hungary and Poland relatively quickly managed to subvert democracy, to transform democracy into those various forms of semi-authoritarian regimes where executive power actually confronts almost no checks on its power, where there are serious violations of human rights, where independent institutions are almost all gone, and also where a powerful conservative right-wing ideology prevails. But that's not the key point, because the usual defense of these authoritarian leaders in the East is that they are being investigated, punished, disciplined by you because of their ideological preferences. And I would say that that's not entirely true. The most important thing is that they are violating the core principles of the European Union legal order, which very clearly says in Article 2, which are the core essentials values, fundamental values of the European Union. So by, for example, subverting the independence of the judiciary, that goes very much against the core principle of European Union, which is independent judiciary. Without independent judiciary, you cannot have a well-functioning European Union, because much of the implementation of EU law is based on the independent national courts. There's very little that European administration does directly. 80% of European tasks are done by independent bodies of member states. So if member states transform their judiciary into subservient rubber stamp of the government, then you don't have a necessarily guarantee that the EU law will be faithfully and neutrally implemented in member states. And that is the core. That's the core of the problem, both in Poland and Hungary. So the counter argument of Orban and Kaczynski, that they are merely representing alternative, different values of Christian Europe, it's not true. It's basically just a sort of a pretext for something much more fundamental, which is their own version ideal of illiberal democracy.
Professor Bugarič, you've written extensively on the issue, and if I'm not mistaken, about a year ago, one of your scholarly articles became a bit of a political football when Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša quoted, or perhaps I should say misquoted you in his letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. But the gist of it, the gist of your writings, as I understand it, is that somewhere along the way, something went horribly wrong, and not necessarily only in the last couple of years. So what was it? What did we as democratic societies overlook, or what was hidden from us if we go down that route?
If you're referring to the same article that the Prime Minister Janša quoted in his letter to European Commission, then I was basically talking about the last 20 years constitutional development. That was mostly, it was about Slovenia, it was also about Hungary. And the core point was that slowly after the accession to EU in 2004, those countries changed legally. So they acquired new constitutions, new legislation, new people were elected to power and so on. But deeply underneath, many things did not change. They remain relatively constant. So there was a lot of, baggage, accompanying that change of the legal rules. And that was problematic because we got constitutional democracies on paper, on the books, but with still few Democrats that would actually support those democracies and fight for them and fight for their core principles. So that was the core issue, which was not a quite a novel insight. This insight or this idea was floating, I remember, at least in Slovenia for a long time. And the late Professor France Bučar was one of those who was constantly warning about this sort of gap or disparity between the formal rules on one hand, which looked, on the surface, it looked European and cosmopolitan and liberal, and the actual practice, which lagged behind. So I think that was the core message of my work at that time.
If you allow me, Nataša, just a follow-up, would it be fair to say that the new accession countries, the 10 countries that joined the EU in 2004 and then subsequent countries, that they felt that they've achieved their primary political and social goal in joining the EU, not realizing or avoiding the uncomfortable fact that the real work should have only begun after the accession?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I couldn't agree more. I think there was a huge under appreciation of the fact that democracy is never should never taken for granted. It's not something that can be created overnight. Many people speak about 2-3 generations that are needed to create a stable, robust democracy, and that was, I think, the core problem of the new Democrats at that time. So they thought that actually when we joined the EU, when then relatively quickly we also joined the euro, that was it. And then after that, we became equal to other more robust European member states, which could not be further from the truth, because very quickly it became quite clear that these two worlds, are quite different, quite apart. So with the election then of new authoritarians, these differences then became just more accentuated and more transparent.
Are the autocrats around the world in the region on the rise? And that might be a rhetorical question, because people have lost faith in democracy, because people believe the populists, the autocrats, more that they will deliver. And what didn't they get from the Democrats in a democracy that they think that the autocrats might provide or do just a better job? So are people losing faith in democracy?
That's probably the most pertinent and the most critical question at the moment, because if you look at the various polls and surveys around the world, I think they more or less confirm what you just said, because people are just dissatisfied with the rules, with the regimes that did not deliver in the last 20. We are talking about a longer trend. So I think it's fundamentally wrong to think that it was only because of the financial crisis 2009 and then the migration crisis that we see now this emergence of this dissatisfaction. We're talking about the response to the absence of sort of a more profound democracy in the last 20, 30 years. So this is a huge shift in global politics. And yes, autocrats actually promise many different things. So I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind, because many people, liberals on the centers and on the left think that somehow authoritarians are somehow represent some kind of aberration, that they are a mistake. No, they're elected by the people. In Hungary, they have been elected for the last 11 years. In Poland, 6 years. Trump still has 74 million of supporters. So we're talking about democratically elected autocrats. That's something quite different, I would say, compared with most of older versions of autocrats who used military force. So there's this metaphor. If you look at the older models of autocracy, you just look on the street, you see tanks, military vehicles, and use of weapons. Now autocrats use elections, use the electoral polls, and they get elected. And then they learn very skillfully how to manipulate democratic rules to turn democracy on its head, to change it then gradually into some kind of a regime which is neither pure authoritarianism nor, of course, fully working democracy. Because if you look at Hungary and Poland, I think it would be a mistake to argue that those are authoritarian regimes a la Pinochet, Chile, or even worse examples, like Nazis and fascists in the past. These are very different kind of animals today, because for example, in Hungary, there's still a real option that opposition might win next year. That's something that does not exist in the other older forms of authoritarianism. But on the other hand, they suppress civil rights. They suppress the power of the opposition. They annihilate, the power of independent institutions. They don't like independent courts. They don't like independent media. Basically, they don't like anything that is independent and that does not agree with their point of view.
You've mentioned before that democracy and its institutions were taken for granted, which obviously is the case, but it seems to go deeper than that, that a lot of democratic standards turned out to be little more than gentlemen's agreements, that things were accepted or non-accepted because it was the way. And then what the autocrats found out, that if you simply ignore the established rules, then you can get your way and still be technically within the legal framework. Is there a way, do you see a way to step away from that? Because this does, going forward, set a dangerous precedent, not just in the political and legal sphere.
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. Yeah, this is probably the key sort of fundamental contradiction or difficulty of the current political situation, because what you just described is actually, and we have a chapter in our book, which I mentioned before we started this conversation, about this phenomenon, and which is, we call it in the legal jargon, unwritten norms. So the most important fact about the current political situation is a huge depolarization. So in the situation of depolarization, unwritten norms are no longer upheld by the both sides of political spectrum. So people simply ignore things which were taken for granted for centuries in certain more developed democracies. So for example, when in America Trump refused to when the Congress refused to nominate or consider the candidate of President Obama for Supreme Court, that was a serious violation of unwritten norm. And there are many other examples of this kind of unwritten norms. Some people describe them as mutual tolerance. So basically, you treat your opponent with respect and you acknowledge legitimacy of your opponent. Now, the authoritarians / populists do exactly the opposite. One of the first claims they make is, you are a traitor. You do not represent our country. You work for foreign interest. Orban is saying that, all the time, not only for George Soros, but for the opposition. Putin actually invented this vocabulary much before, Orban and Kaczynski and others came to power. And Trump used this rhetoric, and the Slovenian prime minister does exactly the same. So basically, he sees, everywhere, the traitors, the enemies. So that's why we have all this conversation that somebody is, unnecessarily transporting our internal problems to, I don't know, Brussels, to Europe. But that's, this is a perfectly legitimate, a vibrant democratic discussion which should be conducted on all different kind of levels. But that's underscores the pertinency of your argument. So how then to protect these unwritten norms is a very, very difficult question, because if you have half of the political spectrum that doesn't care about them, then it's quite unclear, because what you need is some kind of, in America, they call this bipartisan support. So with bipartisan support, these things were possible. Now that bipartisan support is gone, it is difficult to think about, how to sustain unwritten principles. So, and that then, applies in to other countries as well. Oh, of course, there are differences, different traditions of these unwritten norms, but that's I think you identified the core sort of the cancer of a democratic culture at the moment.
Part of that cancer might also be the rise of populism that you have mentioned, the rise of populists, and you described before the difference between the autocrats in the past and the autocrats of today, and there are as well the many faces of populisms. How do you understand them?
Yeah, that's another argument that we try to make in the book. We try to distinguish between the authoritarian populist and democratic populist. It's true that if you look around the world, you see mostly that authoritarian populists are those that are in vogue today. So there's plenty of them. But still, there are democratic populists like Bernie Sanders, like Syriza was in Greece, like Podemos in Spain, who use certain populist techniques and ideological premises, but not with aim or purpose to undermine democracy. Actually, they want to strengthen democracy. And actually, if you look back long enough in history, you would see that the history of populism, which originated in the US in the late 19th century with the party, which was called the Populist Party, was actually democratic populism. What changed the character of populism was unfortunate development in Europe when Nazis and fascists also movement partake in many aspects on many populist core components and claims, which is the distinction between we, the people, the huge antagonism between the elites and the people, and the use of rhetoric of hatred and so on and so on. So yes, there are democratic populists, there are few around the world, but the core question then becomes, which is like more for political scientists to figure out why we live in the world where there are so few democratic populists.
And again, we come to the basic issue. What can be done to step away from the precipice, from the brink, and more importantly, who should be the one taking action? Because quite clearly, the people who argue for the status quo, as things once were, are not going to see their day come back.
I think it's fair to say that it's possible to see sort of the way that for example, look at the Hungarian case at the moment. Even though it doesn't sound very promising, but at last, the opposition parties realized that they need to form united coalition. That's the only way to defeat Orban. It's true that many parts of coalitions have very different political ideas and programs, and the current contender for prime ministerial post is a conservative politician, so not all of opposition leaders agree with them, but it shows how important it is to have sort of a united front of people who deeply believe in democracy. So no matter his views on certain contentious political and social issues, he's a firm believer in democracy. He clearly sees the corrupt nature of Orban regime. And that sort of kind of united front of committed Democrats is something that is needed. And secondly, in addition to that, sort of a clear idea, what went wrong with the liberal, and also because one of the problems of liberals and left is that they don't look enough of what they went wrong, when they were in power, in many governments and countries in the last 25 years. So it is really essential that they come out with a strong, powerful ideas, programs, how to, tackle that. So, for example, for me, in America, Bernie Sanders was a good example of that. Syriza was a less perfect example, but it had certain vague ideas, not very well developed, how to tackle, the problems of mostly the European Union imposed austerity in Greece and so on. If I look at Slovenia, I see only opposition which is united against the current government, but with very few ideas, what to do after that. So I fear that much more is needed. We need a clear sort of vision, idea, sense of ideas, that then it also needs to be delivered. Like Sanders was very clear. Free healthcare, education, tuitions are killing, young students in America. If you have to pay, $80,000 to $100,000 for 1 year of study at the top Ivy League university, that's not sustainable. That's insane. So these are the kind of the things that you have. People, worry about their jobs, about their employment. So there are many, many issues that were not adequately dealt with in the past, and they need new, different solutions. Not to mention, climate change and. Not to mention social issues, identity issues. These are at the moment the most contentious ones. So more and more governments and parties are being divided upon the question of about the questions of sexual, racial, religious identity. And here we see a lot of problems for the parties on the left because they are not entirely sure how to deal with it. If you look at the reaction from the electorate, at the moment they seem to reward mostly the conservative side of the spectrum. But I think it's fundamentally wrong to think, as some Democrats suggest right now, that would be good to back away for the moment from the social issues and work only on the economic issue. I think that is a fundamental mistake, which is not very likely to deliver success for Biden Democrats at the moment. I think we need a hard, difficult work on both front and also convince the electorate that that's what is mutually reinforcing and connected.
Professor, in terms of defending democracy, rule of law, human rights, all the values, the EU values, and taking into account the EU perspective, two questions. How long do you think the courts can hold on in defending those norms? And on a scale from, 1 to 10, you're mentioning we are in a challenging and serious times. On a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you? And of course, how long can the courts defend? Hold on.
Well, thanks. Another great question. So the courts are very good in the initial stage of authoritarian upturn because this is like the first, the second year when authoritarians get in power. So courts can do many different things. Look at the again, I constantly refer to the US case, which is actually a good case because it shows many lessons to the rest of the world. So the courts were essential, in preventing Trump to, hijack the power illegally, after January 6th. So they basically just threw out all the cases because, they found them unfounded. There was absolutely no empirical evidence for most of the claims. So and you look at Poland. Unlike Hungary, in Poland, it seems you have more strongly independent judges who are also ruling in several instances about the government. In Hungary, you don't see that. So that's a good positive lesson. So in the early stage of the authoritarian search to power, there's a lot of room for courts to behave like, I use this metaphor from my good friend and colleague Tom Ginsberg's work, speed bumps. They slow down the authoritarian surge to power, but they cannot prevent it. But once authoritarians became entrenched in power, I don't think that there is much that courts can do. So that's, for example, Hungary is a good example. After you have authoritarian power in 10 years, the Constitutional Court is basically just a rubber stamp. So most of there was a recent empirical analysis of the Hungarian Constitutional Court. Vast majority of judges side in 80 to 85% of the decision with the government. That's not independent Constitutional Court. That's your first question. The second one, how worried I am. I mean, actually, these are, Chinese have this saying that they say that we are living in interesting times. So, by that they usually mean, very worrying times. And I think that it's what we are witnessing is, what Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist and communist, spoke about the interregnum. So the old world, is dying. The old paradigms, the old political ideals are no longer, controlling the, and no longer sort of hegemonic, and yet the new has not been born. So in this interregnum, many things are possible. For example, we can see a return of Trump in 2024, but maybe not. It's too early now to tell. So how would that affect the global world politics? Hard to know. On the other hand, we have many powerful, strong autocrats around the world. Three largest democracy in the world, India, US, and Brazil, were until recently controlled by autocrats. That itself is quite worrying. So I don't think it's a time for a sort of calm and peaceful meditation. I think it's time for really for concern, for action, and for a constant alert. To always remind people that democracy is nothing which is given, which is preordained. It has to be fought for all the time, and that's, I think, what is also responsibility of public intellectuals, to remind people of that and to try to argue and show why democracy is so important. So I am, so if your scale was from 1 to 10, I would say that I'm not necessarily pessimistic, but, I think it can go either way. So I'm somewhere in between, half, 5. So maybe, we'll end up, well, in 5 to 10 years, but we don't know at the moment.
And on this call to action, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Professor Bugarič, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.